organized under some pretty interesting circumstances. Obviously, the pandemic is ongoing, but physically, we're in the European Parliament's press room. We have Iratxe García with us, the president of the Socialists and Democrats group in the European Parliament. As is customary, she'll be making some introductory comments on the plenary that will be beginning this afternoon, and you will be able to ask your questions live and also online. So let me give Iratxe the floor, please. Thank you very much. And let me begin by thanking our technicians that have made it possible for us to hold this press conference. I'd like to thank all those who are working in these difficult circumstances on the staff. I'd also like to thank all journalists who are making a massive effort during recent days. And we've heard about reconciliation during recent weeks, and anyone who's involved in reconciliation, thank you very much. But it's important for this House, the House of European Democracy, to continue to function, and I think that is something that we have achieved. The Parliament continued its work. We've got remote voting, remote meetings, and in my political group, right from the start, we've been working to propose solutions, and you'll have been able to follow our activities. I have constantly been in contact with President Sassoli and the other group presidents, as well as the President of the European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen. And I've obviously also been in permanent contact with all commissioners and social democrat prime ministers. This is a historic time and we need to show responsibility. And the concern that we had at the start of the crisis with regard to how we were going to ensure that European institutions would remain active and would provide a response to the crisis, I think has been achieved with the efforts made by everyone. The Socialist and Democrat group presented a few weeks ago a detailed action plan to emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, which includes short-term, medium-term and long-term measures. And we're now starting to come up with clear, tangible proposals based on that roadmap. Clearly, this pandemic has surprised all of us, and now we have to face new problems that we hadn't envisaged prior to it beginning. But at the same time, what the crisis does highlights weaknesses that the European Union already had. For example, increasing inequalities between people, but also between regions, and also the lack of common action in some areas, for example, when it comes to health. And that's why our political group has proposed the concept of a health union. And what we have to do now is speed up reforms. We shouldn't be changing direction. We should be speeding up our progress towards a fairer society with more justice and less inequality. And we need an economy that is good for the real economy rather than speculation and response to the concerns of citizens. I think this is something that we have reflected in the joint resolution that we'll be voting on tomorrow during the Parliament's plenary session. Obviously, not everything that the Socialist and Democrat group wanted to include in the resolution is there, but nevertheless, I think it is time to make an effort to overcome divisions and regardless of different political groups' ideological differences, we tried to come up with a position that's as unanimous as possible within the European Parliament. The Parliament is sending out an important message to the Commission and Council for the recovery plan. It needs to be a global overall plan, which includes the multi-annual financial framework and also our funds. We have support from the majority of political groups in this House, and the Council needs to understand that it needs the European Parliament. The Parliament is clear that it will not accept a proposal for the upcoming MFF that does not reflect our ambition, because our citizens wouldn't understand that. It's the future of the European Union which is at stake, and we need to, and people continue to believe that the European Union is useful. And that's the key message, because I think that as a result of this health crisis, when we emerge, we need to have a European Union project that is a strong project, because otherwise our citizens will no longer have trust in us. Let me say clearly that we are prepared to vote against a bad agreement, and we have already prepared a contingency plan. I said this during the last plenary session before the COVID-19 crisis when we were discussing a resolution on the MFF. And at that time, I said very clearly that our political group would not be supporting an MFF and multi-annual financial framework that didn't cover the needs and priorities of the European Union. It's our credibility that's at stake here. Solidarity is important, of course, but what's at stake here is the future of the single market. No one will be able to reactivate their economy individually without their neighbour's economy also being reactivated. Either we all emerge from the crisis or none of us do, because if some countries collapse economically in the European Union, the whole EU will be affected. And that's the message that my group wants to send out to those countries who may well have doubts or uncertainties with regard to the need for this ambitious plan. Either we all emerge from the crisis or none of us do. We're calling for a massive effort from the Commission, a €2 billion budget for the recovery plan. This is a historic amount, but the crisis we're in is historic. And this is the best way to emerge from the crisis, to transform our economies and to boost the resilience of our societies. We need to boost strategic sectors of our economies, such as industry, but also save our tourism sectors, support the network of businesses, and also support workers and small businesses. Everything that relates to Europe's economic activity. We believe there is a strong need for Eurobonds supported by the community budget. This is something that was reflected in the previous resolution that we adopted, and we continue to insist on that in our group. We also have to increase the amount of own resources to 2% of EU GNI. We've been discussing various measures to increase the EU budget without putting more of a burden on member states, and now is the time to do that. We shouldn't be putting more of a burden on those who have difficulties already. Otherwise, we will fail when it comes to convergence, and increased inequalities, which will weaken the union, will be created. So the main part of this plan needs to be based on subsidies and direct payments. Another important point for us is the single market guarantee and trying to avoid the distortion of the single market, because flexibility, the ways of making state aid more flexible, measures which have been taken as a result of the crisis were of course necessary, but problems have been caused. You have to see how member states have used state aid. If you look at the figures, you'll see that just one country has used over 50% of this assistance. And so this is distorting convergence of sustainability criteria. So we need the recovery plan to bring measures that support sectors at the community level so that we can do away with these distortions that are being produced. Because there are many sectors in many member states that don't have this support. So we need this support to be at the European level so that these funds can provide support to large businesses, small businesses, and strategic sectors in a coordinated manner right across the European Union. In addition, we can't abandon and forget about policies that have been key in the European Union, that are part of the MFF, for example, cohesion, agriculture. In addition, we've seen the importance of the food sector during this crisis and the transport sector as well. So as I said, we're not forgetting about previous priorities, quite the opposite. We need to speed up our transformation, and therefore we need to prioritize the digital agenda, the European Green Deal, and European sovereignty over these sectors. We need to ensure, for example, that we have supply of products, first and foremost pharmaceuticals. We saw that this was a significant element in this crisis, and we can't have this happen again. We can't have Europe not having access to a supply of essential medicines. as well as the resolution, just briefly to talk about other items that are on the agenda. Well, as you know, there'll be a debate on the situation on the rule of law in Hungary. Unfortunately, since the European Parliament voted in favour of triggering Article 7 against Hungary, the only thing that has happened is that the rule of law situation has got worse. Over the last 2 years, things have got worse. The Council has to unblock negotiations now on a rule of law mechanism to condition access to EU funds to compliance with the rule of law. And I think it's time for the EPP expels Fidesz from its ranks. I don't know what they're waiting for. Last week, the NGO Freedom House listed Hungary among those countries that are no longer democracies, and that's very serious indeed. There's a EU member state which considers itself an organization that assesses the situation of democracy in its member states, and this is now a country that is not a democracy. So this is utterly unacceptable within the European Union. So therefore, we want to send out that message in the Parliament debate. We're also going to talk about tracing apps. We can't have the pandemic used as an excuse to lower rights and guarantees. And for my group, it's crucial for these apps to respect EU rules on privacy and data protection. They need to be voluntary and temporary, and they shouldn't be used for commercial purposes. They need to be fully transparent for users and properly supervised by data protection authorities. We're also going to be talking, of course, about the anniversary of the Schuman Declaration. We need to resume the conference on the future of the EU, which we think now needs to focus on reconstruction in the future. We've been talking about the future, and the future includes reconstruction, and it's an opportunity to listen to citizens and see which reforms are necessary to ensure the EU can become more effective. At the start of the crisis, many citizens criticized the EU for a lack of action, but in order for the EU to act in the sphere of health, for example, it has to have the appropriate remit. If we don't have the competences, we can't act. So it's an opportunity to reflect on our EU and make it as effective for our citizens as possible. We're also going to look at the plan that the Commission's going to be presenting. We're waiting for a plan from the Commission, but the important thing is to have general guidelines at the community level, the principle of prevention, but also the principle of non-discrimination are important there. And obviously, we'll have to look at how that can be guaranteed, because the final goal needs to be to return to this new normality that we're talking about. But in order to do that, we need to establish another series of conditions. Measures need to be implemented, and first and foremost, that relates to people's lives and health, and then subsequently we need to adapt the situation. We've several times insisted on the fact that the measures taken need to be temporary, obviously. Restrictions on citizens' movements can only take place because the pandemic is in place, so they have to be temporary, and we have to move away from bilateral agreements between member states. It has to be the EU that sets out an overarching framework for action. And to conclude, let me say that I was very concerned about the ruling from the German Constitutional Court, and that's something, therefore, that I wanted to raise, because that questions the independence of the European Central Bank and the primacy of EU law. Germany is a founding member state of the EU, and for them to question the legal foundations of the EU is something that causes concern. The European Court of Justice provided a necessary and clear response. It's time for unity. We're providing a strong community response, and today more than ever, given the crisis, it's clear that we need a strong political project, and that's what we're going to be working towards in a committed manner from our political group. It's time to be responsible, to work hard, and to try and ensure that citizens see Europe as somewhere where their problems are resolved. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Alors, il y a visiblement
Okay. Obviously, we haven't received questions from the journalists yet. So I would suggest that we conclude, in fact, because there are no journalists in the room. Iratxe. Okay, I hope this is just an exception to the rule and that very soon we will be able to return to normality and to do our work. In the meantime, I want to thank the technical services of the European Parliament who have made this available today. And we've been able to share the work and objectives of our political group. And I hope that soon again we will be able to meet. Thank you.